Okay. So, welcome to AP European History with Dr. Brovkin. We continue our study of World War II. In some of the preceding videos, we talked about the fall of France and the appeasement policies. And now I want to focus on the Operation Barbarossa, which is the attack on the Soviet Union, how it came into being, when exactly it was prepared, what it was supposed to accomplish, and how feasible it was. So we're really talking about a year from June 1940, when the Germans enter Paris, the fall of France, to the June of 1941, which is the beginning of Germans or Hitler's attack on the Soviet Union and the beginning of the Operation Barbarossa. So when exactly did Hitler decide to attack the Soviet Union? There's two answers. One is the long term and the short term. The long term, this was in Mein Kampf. I mean, he really, ideology of Nazism was expansion of space, the Lebensraum in the East, and this was in his thoughts from the very beginning. As for the practical, it was a very difficult undertaking. You know, it's a huge country, and you have to have serious preparation if you want to have a chance of success. So the consensus among specialists is that it was after the Finnish War. After the Germans, this is why I told you earlier, the Finnish War is so important because the Germans watched it, how a small country tied up the mighty Soviet Union and won the war. Won in a sense of Clausewitz. Won in a sense it made the prosecution of the war so expensive that Stalin gave up and decided to sign a peace rather than conquer Finland. From that point of view, it was a Finnish victory, even though they lost territory. So that means somewhere in after the fall of France, it became feasible. There were no more enemies left. Hitler controlled all of Europe and pretty much integrated most of European economy, including French factories and those in Bohemia, of course, and Hungary and Italy and in Switzerland, as some new revelations show. And even Sweden had a lot of military orders for German army in steel production and so on. So yes, sometime after the fall of France, there's a serious consideration of preparing the Feldzug, which means an attack on the Soviet Union that is beginning to be prepared, which is called Plan Barbarossa. Now, it's interesting to compare what exactly this plan was and how accurate it was. The most important item of this plan is that the German army would conduct a successful blitzkrieg, which is a lightning war, and enter a line from Arkhangelsk or Archangel in the north to Astrakhan, which is in the spot where the river Volga enters the Caspian Sea. So that is pretty much all of European Russia. Just beyond the Volga is the steppe lands that go to the Ural Mountains, which is pretty empty. I traveled through that area. There's just open field. Most of population and most of Russian industry is in that area, except the ones that were factories built in the Urals mountains, which turned out to be crucial for the survival of the Soviet Union in this confrontation. Now, how realistic was it? I mean, it's a huge territory. It's a territory several times bigger, I mean, at least 10 times bigger than Germany. So was it feasible? It's a difficult question. Some historians would argue it was not feasible from the very beginning. Others would argue, yes, it was feasible, but it had to be a very successful lightning war that would paralyze all of the industrial centers and the army and the communications and the transportation network. That could be done, but in a very precise accomplishment. It's interesting here to compare it to the Schlieffen plan, which also worked only if you do it just right. But if there's any kind of a obstacle, as it turned out in World War I, then it just kind of stopped short of its goal. So this is we shall see how it evolved. Now, there's a lot of interesting speculations these days about Stalin's intentions in this year, from June 1940 to June 1941, as a kind of a new revisionist school of thought that argues that Stalin was preparing for an attack on Germany at that same time. And this is, of course, a fascinating theory, because if it is true, then, of course, it is used politically by those people who argue, well, one dictator is worth the other, and the Germans were attacking the Soviet Union, well, the Soviet Union was planning to attack Germany, and of course, that could well be true. We shall discuss it in a minute, whether this could be true. But there's one point difference. Even if the Soviet Union did attack Germany, what it intended to do, and what it did do in 1945, is establish communist regime in Germany. That is not the same as mass extermination of the people, as this is what the Germans were doing, and not only to the Jews, but also to the Russians as well. So Stalin victory would not have been a catastrophe to the German nation. It would have been a catastrophe for the bourgeoisie and others in terms of a communist regime that was established in 1945, but it was certainly not an existential threat to the existence of the German people, which it was in case of a German victory. In any case, is it true or not? The evidence that is used by those who argue that Stalin was preparing an attack on the Soviet Union is that if you look at the positioning of the troops, they were all very close to the border. All the airfields were placed right at the border in the newly territories that West Belarus and Ukraine that were acquired after Poland, Nazi-Soviet Pact divided Poland. Now these were Belarusian lands, and there was no Polish population there. In any case, that this is used as a reason that he was an offensive posture. It was designed to fly as deep into Western Europe as possible, and therefore there were these hundreds of airplanes in the new airfields. Another interesting fact is that the armored vehicles that were deliberately invented, designed, and put in production in 1940 were those that could ride both as a tank, but also had replaceable tires that would be much faster if it drove on highways. And given the fact that Germany had a very good system of asphalt highways, the famous autobahns, the argument goes it was designed for a quick and swift offensive into the heart of Germany, as was actually designed to do in 1914, if you recall, Russian attack on East Prussia in World War I. Now, maybe all that is true. Moreover, I am inclined to think that it probably is true that there were offensive operations planning, just as normal. Any general staff who is planning a war does plan for offensive operations. That in itself is not in any way a proof of any kind of intent. Now, there's a psychological interpretation which I find also very, very persuasive, which is by Robert Tucker, one of the highly respected biographers of Comrade Stalin, his trilogy, 3 huge books that he spent years and years researching. Now, what Professor Tucker says, actually, is that Stalin dreamed of an ideal scenario. And the ideal scenario would be if Germany and France exhausted each other in a mutually devastating war, and then the Soviet army would march into Berlin and establish Soviet power and create a communist revolution, which is a very persuasive plan because it actually is built on the results of World War I. And that is very typical for a lot of people, generals and statesmen. They acted as if it's going to be a replay of World War I. Very persuasive argument. That is indeed what Stalin may have been thinking and hoping and planning. However, these plans, even if they existed, and we will never know unless there's some kind of personal archive of Stalin that would be discovered, All this was shattered by Hitler's defeat of France. That's it. There's no more exhausting war between France and Germany. France is defeated. German army is in Paris, and therefore all of Europe is now facing the Soviet Union. So what are exactly Stalin's actions in this year from June 1940 to June 41? It is pretty assertive. As soon as Paris is taken in the summer of 1940, the Soviets take over the Baltic countries. They incorporate there as a sort of agreed to sphere of influence, and Moldova, and they position their troops on the border. So it looks like he's in a kind of a assertive position. Nevertheless, as time goes on, you could see in Soviet negotiations with the Germans is that it becomes more and more polite and more accommodating. And all the instructions that Stalin sends, including to Molotov, his foreign minister, who goes to Berlin in November 1940, show anything but offensive spirit. This is why this theory falls into pieces. The Soviet Union is accommodating. Basically, Stalin is afraid of Hitler. He's trying to fulfill all obligations. He's trying to do all kinds of deliveries and supplies because he wants to postpone the war as much as possible. He kind of feels that it is coming, but you need to postpone it, and all Soviet actions on the ground actually show not an offensive posture, but rather a scared posture, that he is afraid. And all the reports, we now know there was intelligence reports by Mr. Zorge from Japan, who wrote and named the date of the German attack. He dismissed it. He even sent murderers to kill Zorge because he thought it's a disinformation and a lie. He refused to believe that Hitler would attack the Soviet Union. He hoped to against hope that a time could be saved and no attack would come. When it did come on the 22nd of June 1941. And I'll stop at that, and we will continue with the actual beginning of the Operation Barbarossa in our next segment. Don't forget to subscribe. We're almost at 200 of AP European History with Dr. Brovkin. Thank you.